Knowing Violence, Psychiatric Hegemony and the Corruption of Care. I'm a newcomer this year to the field of medical anthropology. My postgrad work was in critical approaches to food security and cultural food studies, and this past year I've joined the Center for Science, Technology, and Society at the University of Notre Dame. This was my academic entree into medical anthropology, but my interest in the field originated in my own extraordinary experience with medicine. Thus, my perspectival and analytical stances negotiate the etic-etic complementarity in a very particular way. Certainly mine is a testimony of embodied experience. It's also one that, in its critical formation, is, I think, distinct from the thrust of other such voices. I acknowledge from the very first instance that these particularities of position lend evident and unavoidable elements of particularity to my analysis that seem at once both unsophisticated and, in their way, also privileged. I hope that whatever its limitations, the richness of my experiential knowledge might, I hope, also capacitate a rich theoretical one, and in that spirit I offer this work. In this paper, I'm going to propose that we think about the relationship between care and violence differently and more tentatively than we, even and perhaps especially we in the academy, conventionally do. Of course, the attempts to theorize each concept are profuse in number and superabundant in content. Here, rather than grasping at some particular aspects of these conceptually opulent spaces, I will take care and violence each on their very roughest terms. So if care might be theoretically slippery enough to be understood in many dimensions, feeling, act, relationship, practice, molfason, tranto, and many more, and violence can be likewise understood in many dimensions, physical, social, cultural, epistemic, narrative, discursive, Galtung, Fricker, Grossvogel, Cover, Escobar, and many more, I propose that it's most helpful to think of care and violence, at least in this analysis, each as fully as we can. What we lose in precision and focus, I hope will win in space for the problematization of their relationship, which is, in the end, what I hope to achieve in this paper. Part 1. Narrativity and Translation. Fasson has emphasized the importance of the trace of violence as that which transforms it from a phenomenologically real but politically non-viable experience to one that, by way of its inscription on and in the body, can be inscribed also in the formality of law and procedure and so transferred to the realm of public intelligibility. These questions of visibility, translatability, and intelligibility lie at the core of the relationship between violence and care that I approach here, and hence matters of narrativity and perlocutionary consequence turn essential. But if Fasson's insight of the trace regards that which can translate the violence of the experiential and the physical into political effect, I want to suggest a similar sort of translation, but one that translates not from the phenomenological to the political, but rather to what we might think of as the metaphysical or the cosmic. Cover's seminal Violence in the Word articulates the violence inherent to the act of legal interpretation to law. Of course, this connection itself isn't original. Weber's notion of the state's aspirational monopoly on violence figures widely into social and political criticism, of course, but Cover's emphasis on the translation, the act of translation of law into violence, comprehends this mechanism more meticulously. He articulates the consequentiality inherent to law's systematized operation by socially invested people acting at each of its cogs. In the Sentencing Act, for example, the judge unleashes a whole chain of what can only be construed as violent events. As a result of the judge's interpretation, he writes, somebody loses his freedom, his property, his children, even his life. When interpreters of the law have finished their work, they frequently leave behind victims whose lives have been torn apart by these organized social practices of violence. I think you can begin to see then how Cover's explication of law's perlocutionarity might be mapped onto care. This is the point I want to situate then, that law and all those nomu that work as its socially administrable proxies and analogs entails violence. Whether or not these might be justifiable violences are another question. That they are violences and that they unleash chains of violences is what I want to name and make central here. If care takes its form as something that both exists within a particular metanomos and installs its own internal nomos, then care might, like Cover's law, hold within it the seeds and structures for inducing and effecting extraordinary chains of violence. In other words, it might be the case that care can act quite the opposite of responding to violence, as I think we intuitively understand it to do, in precisely the contrary way. Part 2, the empirical case. I am the empirical case. As I prefaced, I approach this paper and my analysis with all the reflexivity I'm able to summon. Still, it is my story, I am invested in it, and if I do not in any case accept any thinker's claim to objectivity, I certainly make no such claim here. I want to situate my particular, not as a general, but as a real incidence and coincidence of persons, events, actions, and circumstances that comprise a part of this reality whose particularity we have to acknowledge if our epistemo-poetic gestures are to be good ones. So, the empirical. For about 12 years, I've suffered serious gastrointestinal problems. In real terms, I have a lot of stomach pain and produce a lot of diarrhea. In 2005, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease following a begrudgingly tolerated colonoscopy. After several years of trying different medications and getting the pain and supermotility more or less under control, I opted out. I didn't want to regularly consume pharmaceuticals or have to visit the doctor each month, and I preferred to treat myself with simplicity and without the intervention of modern medicine. I ate plenty of good food, I got exercise and fresh air, I generally tried to live well. At the same time, I moved overseas, and the good Mediterranean environments of my new context kept me generally in good health for most of the next decade. In 2014, however, while working on my PhD through Cardiff University in the UK, I suffered what gastroenterology frames as a bout of active Crohn's, 8 continuous months of increasingly severe pain and daily massive episodes of diarrhea. Finally, I went to a doctor in the UK. He suggested that a colonoscopy was in fast order and recommended that I wait in the hospital for the first opening. The first bookable appointment, if I chose to instead wait, lay 6 months into the future. I took his advice and waited in the hospital for an opening. It was a decision, a bad decision, that utterly transformed my existence, my being, my understanding of the world, and my entire scope of capabilities and possibilities. To make gross allusion to a long, bad, detail-laden story, in the filthy hospital ward, filled with many people, few nurses, fewer doctors, and no soap in the soap dispensers, I immediately caught several infections, each worse than the previous, and soon I began to lapse into and out of consciousness. I'm a former elite athlete in rowing and running, and my heart rate is, like that of many athletes, very low. This made the heart monitor sound too regularly for the nurse's liking, and they disengaged the monitor. I had a cardiac arrest, the hospital staff failed to recognize it, and my heart stopped totally for 20 minutes. That's an amount of dead time usually understood to lie at the very limits of revivability. I did return to life, as it were, by way of a long coma. When I woke up, a month or so later, I discovered that I could not move my body and that I was in any case fastened to the bed by all numbers of devices and tubes. I also discovered an intensity of pain that I had never before even the capacity to imagine. And I say this, one, having suffered from major attacks of Crohn's, or given my now wholesale skeptical appraisal of medical knowledge and nosology, as it were, at least from whatever excruciating stomach region pains really did and do continue to afflict me. And two, having performed as an elite athlete accustomed to body-wrenching limit performances. One of the new pains I discovered upon waking was in my legs and feet. It turned out that no carer had thought it proper to move my body while I was comatose, nor to help afterwards when I discovered that I could not move it myself. Neither did they care to prop my feet upright so that they did not atrophy, flopped, in something of a techno-modern foot binding that leaves me still with what I euphemistically call a falling problem. Doctors, it turned out, had authoritatively declared physical therapy of any kind to be out of the question. A second pain I discovered upon waking was the volcanic eruption at the entrance to my stomach. One of the tubes attached to me shot a constant jet of high-speed liquid, food, into it for 15 hours each day, and the point where this jet entered my already pain-damaged viscera excruciated in a way that words fail. At the same time, my body reacted to this visceral assault by rejecting its contents in extraordinary and pained flows of diarrhea. The carers, as they were, refused to change either of these circumstances, and I soon found out why. While I'd been comatose, doctors had convened to establish and declare from among themselves the truth of what had caused my sudden deterioration and cardiac arrest. Surely, they reasoned, it could not relate to the 8 months of diarrhea and pain with which I'd reported to the hospital, as that seemed too simple a thing. More surely still, it could not relate to the nosocomially produced sequelae I suffered following my decision to wait in the hospital for that advertised colonoscopy. The only reasonable explanation, they concluded authoritatively, was that I must be responsible for it myself. That is, while I was in a coma and with no positive evidence at their hands whatsoever, the doctors diagnosed me. Surely, they reasoned from their seats of absolute epistemic omnipotence, I must be anorexic. I must be the cause of these terrible outcomes. And accordingly, of course, I must be punished for it. That I managed to lose 20 pounds more while in the hospital, tethered to a bed, assaulted by a jettisoned delivery of 2,500 calories per day, not food to be sure, but calories, first while comatose and then while functionally paralyzed, lent no uncertainty to their diagnosis. They knew, in their privileged scientific access to truth and knowledge, that I was anorexic. In their words, as conclusive and certain as they were accusative, what else could it be? What I see in this scenario is a major problem of scientific hegemony, a medicine without the epistemic capacity for diagnosis, perhaps even a medicine that generates from within itself real consequences of sickness and death, cannot lay claim to well-legitimated certitude, knowledge, or the social privileges that these invoke. In order to constitute itself, medicine must know. And so it did. To elide the saga from this point even more tremendously, after 5 months of so construed care in the general hospital, the doctors sentenced me, legally, to return more directly to my opening comments on Cover's portrayal of legal violence and the not distant relation of these practices from ones of care, to a prison, a carceral detention center for anorexics, which they named in sociopolitically appropriated form as a psychiatric hospital, and where I was abused for 5 months more. In Roman terms, I moved legally from sui juris to alieni juris. I did not belong to myself. I belonged to the doctor, to the hospital, to the state. The doctor owned me. Doctors force-fed me to my protest for 5 months total. Absurdly, while making the claim that I was anorexic, they would not allow me to eat. Watchers watched me, capital W, 24 hours a day at a distance of no more than 1 arm's length from my body. And they could not figure out why I weighed so little. I denied vomiting. I denied having ever not eaten. I denied everything they accused me of because I did not do, had never done those things. And upon watching me, capital W, they discovered that indeed I did not vomit. I did receive a continual flow of forced calorie fluid shot into my esophagus, and I had very limited use of my body. They watched me, they surveilled me at every moment of the day. To be surveilled while I lay on the sheets or sat on the toilet and generated extraordinary pained expulsions of diarrhea. To be surveilled when my body reflexively convulsed in pain as the jets of high-speed liquid shot through my esophagus. To be surveilled as I tried to reach for my feet to soothe their fiery pains. I don't think I understood how these banal acts of surveillance, of being watched, could have acted on me with such cosmic consequence. When I rolled over in the middle of the night, unable to sleep in the constant light and noise, or when I woke suddenly from a nightmare, I discovered that there was always there a watcher watching, And in her watching me, she reminded me of the surreal absurdity of it all. All night long, the watcher munched on pretzels that I could not eat because that was not allowed. But she could munch and crunch and have a phone conversation about picking up the kids and a little extra money in the paycheck. And I could only lie there, convulsing in pain, jets of liquid shooting into me, eyes watching me. Again, eliding from this point tremendously, after many months, a Herculean personal labor of physical habilitation, and a long tactic of prudent obeisance, I escaped, went directly to the airport, fled the country, and spent the next year relearning to do all the things they'd taken from me. To walk, to climb stairs, to type at the computer, to use RefWorks to finish my PhD, to sit in the sunshine, to breathe fresh air, to eat real food with friends, untimed, and from a shared loaf of bread. I want to speak more about many aspects of this horror. I want to speak more about force feeding, about how it's rightly recognized in international law as an impermissible torture, about how it's used historically and actually to intimidate and violate prisoners. I want to make visible the real horror of the practice and its real use not only on hunger-striking freedom fighters, though here too it's indefensible, but also on skinny women and old people in hospitals. I want to point out the absurd incompatibility of illegalizing foie gras production, but condoning, endorsing, and indeed sponsoring the same abuse upon people. I'm drawn here to the writings of the suffragettes and the prisoners who suffered and suffer the practice historically and contemporarily. I want to speak more about the metaphysical effectiveness of surveillance, of watchers and watching. To see, to look at, and to watch are different things. I'm drawn here to Illich's writings on the eyes and the gaze. I want to speak more about the epistemic hegemony of scientistic, not scientific, but scientistic medicine, and the violence this does in and of itself to the mystery of the person. I want to speak about the possibilities for not knowing, not understanding, in a modernized world governed by a nomos of knowability and by the sanctioned knowers who are authorized to know. And of course I want to speak more about the many specific practices of so construed care and examine the chains of effect that these practice and unleash, chains that I suspect are, as in Cover's formulation of law, often violence-laden. I will speak more about these things in another moment. Here I want only to broach them, to bring them to your medical anthropologist table and invite you to partake. I'll finish for the moment by way of some conceptual propositions. Part 3, corruptio, optimi, pessima, and the unpersoning effect. Now, it's not only that these medical practitioners dominated me, that they disabled me, that they imprisoned me, that they violated me. It is that they exacted their violences from within the discourse of care, from within the sanction of society, from within the doctor's profession of trust and my credence in it. In their unmaking of my world, to use Scary's words, they acted in perfect conformity with the legal and moral parameters that located theirs. To follow Illich here, it's precisely the zenith of corruption, of perversion, that makes their acts, and the consequences of those acts, so exquisitely degrading and so effectively consequential. It is the perversion of care into violence, of carers into violators, of moral existence into moral extinction, that makes this sort of violence so utterly grotesque and so metaphysically powerful. It is a case of corruptio, optimi, pessima, the corruption of the best become the worst. I propose to understand this experience for me and this act for the many carers who performed it in terms of unpersoning. I want to be as precise as I can and insist on using this word more to articulate the act of demotion from person to something other than person. Whether this is a demotion from subject to object, from agent to thing, or from person to non-person, almost person, temporary person, or anti-person, as Esposito writes. What I want to emphasize here with unpersoning is the demotional experience and the demotional act. rather than the new status itself. Of course, Esposito argues that the dispositive of the person is as problematic as it is pervasive in the modern West. This is a much bigger problem. For now, all I want to recognize is that this dispositive of the person exists, and that it saturates our thoughts. That is, whatever we might think of it. The dispositive of the person locates and saturates the reality in which most of us here live. I'll say at least that it saturates mine. For now, then, I want to sidestep the problematization of personhood itself and emphasize the practices of distinction that it requires us to continually negotiate. In other words, insofar as the person exists, he exists because he's categorically different than some other collection of beings, the non-persons and almost persons, and so on. In short, what is included is that which is not excluded. That's Esposito. And to include a being in the category of persons means identifying that justifying reason why he is not excluded. What I want to emphasize is the active emotion from the first of these categories to the second one, from person to something other than a person. To return to the particular, I claim that the act of attributing a mental health diagnosis upon someone makes at least a first move in the practical operation of such a demotion. Perhaps there are grades and degrees and gravities of the unpersoning act. Among the acts I would claim to be an act of full and complete unpersoning is that of torture, a category that is itself, of course, construable and contestable, but let us say at least that there are some classes of violences that are graver than others, and that torture is what lies at the extreme. What medicine delivered to me was certainly violence, and I would claim that it also had aspects to it. Force feeding is one, of violence in its gravest form. The fullness of its deliveries to my body transformed not only my body, but also with it that very fundamental identity that I'd earlier enjoyed, that of person. The act of provoking, of generating, of delivering this monumental transition is what I propose as unpersoning. And it is this act cum experience, unpersoning, that care turned violence, corruptio optimi pessima, has the capacity to deliver. How then might we begin to understand more meticulously this concept of unpersoning? At this point, I've merely floated the idea, and there remains a lot of work to do in fleshing out its many-layered detail. Several thinkers' conceptual formulations might enter neatly into this labor. Now I'll only broach them. First, Esposito's articulation of the dispositive of the person names the singularity and evitability of the person concept and insists on the precariousness of its ascription. If one is not a person but must be defined to be, understood to be a person, his status as such is likewise not immutable. Second, in a related sense, Agamben's portrayals of the Roman homo sacer and of the concentration camp Musulman emphasize the demotional aspect that I want to capture in this unpersoning. It's not only that there is a distinction, that we make a distinction between the person and the less than person, but that the transfer of a being from bios to zoe is a specifically demotional move. Third, Fricker's conceptualization of the epistemic violence, particularly in the medical encounter's regularized practice of it, Dworkin's more radical writings on the translation of physical violence into an existential or metaphysical one, and Scarry's articulation of the capacity for torture to make and unmake worlds, each help point to how this demotional movement of the self, which we must remember is also a demotional act performed by the so-construed carer, happens. Fourth, on an even more metaphysical plane, Buber's writings on the differences that demarcate an I-thou relationship from an I-it one, and Illich's insistence on the contingency, the mystery, particularity, and freedom inherent to the Samaritan relation, or to the Samaritan response, are, I think, crucially insightful for appreciating the not wholly knowable, and certainly not generalizable, aspects of the person's being that we might try to capture as cosmic. Here, then, I've done no more than raise my real experience of care-turned violence as a subject worthy of more contemplation, and I've raised it here because I think medical anthropology is a privileged place from which to contemplate it. Your wide berth of conceptual resources, broad cache of research and analytical practices, sensitivity to hermeneutic juncture, and appreciation for a diversity of epistemic actors and acts give anthropology a fullness of vision that most disciplinary traditions preclude. I invite medical anthropologists, then, to take up more robustly these questions that I broach. How might we understand and problematize the different combinations of relationships, practices, and effects possibilized within this care violence matrix, as it were? How might medical anthropologists act, in a barefoot sense, as it were, to make visible the normalized practices of care-turned violence that, as in my case, remain concealed, obscured, denied, and invisible? And what is it about the perversional aspect, the corruptional aspect of this care-turned violence, this corruptio optimi, that makes it so especially violating? The questions are yours for the thinking. Thank you. Knowing violence